Is it working? Yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this workshop this morning. My name is Kristina Eichhorst. I am coordinator for counterterrorism and conflict management with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation based in Berlin. And it's a pleasure for me to chair this workshop this morning. It may be one of the last workshops of this incredible conference, but as we all know, the best is always saved for last. So I'm very much looking forward to what our panelists have to say this morning. The title of the workshop is "It Takes a Network to Beat a Network." And there's a slight chance that this slogan might sound familiar to you. It is, of course, a phrase coined by Professor Boaz Ganor, who some of you might know. And we used this phrase as the title for this workshop for several reasons. First of all, it is just such an incredibly catchy phrase. Second, in terms of meaning, it hits the nail on the head, of course, and I will come to that later on. And thirdly, the title is unsurprisingly a reference to the network that is responsible for initiating and co-organizing this workshop together with the ICT. Namely, ICTAC, it's the International Counter-Terrorism Academic Community. Some of you might have heard of it. That actually was founded by Professor Ganor and ICT. So before we come to the topic at hand today, I would like to use the opportunity to give the floor to Professor Krause, who is not only the director of the Institute for Security Policy at the University of Kiel and the main expert on security issues and terrorism in Germany, but also the executive director of ICTAC, and who will say a few words about ICTAC's mission and activities.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Joachim Krause. I'm a professor of political science at Kiel University, not in England, in Germany, the real Kiel from the Kiel channel. And Boaz asked me last year to take over the post of the executive director of the ICTAC, and which had become somewhat dormant during the past few years, and we want to revise it, revitalize it. And one of our attempts is to bring together more and more academic experts in this field to further cooperation between academic experts. And one of our goals is to have such a kind of meeting as we have today, but we will further have another meeting later this day, in which we try to find out what ICTAC can do more in order to further academic cooperation in the field of counterterrorism research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, it takes a network to beat a network. This phrase also refers, of course, to our topic at hand during this workshop. And it describes best what we want to focus on today, namely how to effectively implement counterterrorism measures through networks and by networking. We will look at a whole variety of different levels and aspects of counterterrorism, ranging from the global level at the UN, to cooperation on the international level between states in several respects, such as intelligence and countering terrorist financing, to the civil society level and public or private level, where we will look at countering incitement to terrorism and cooperation with universities. Thus, we will shed a light on a really broad range of issues, which is usually not easy to cover if it wasn't for 5 fabulous speakers who could lead us through this endeavor this morning. So now I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Robert Friedman, founding director of the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange and Professor Emeritus of Criminal Justice at Georgia State University, by Professor Rohan Gunaratna, director of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, by Professor Gregory Rose, professor at the School of Law and the Australian National Center for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong in Australia. I hope I pronounce it in the right way. Professor Alex Schmid, Director of the Terrorism Research Initiative and Research Fellow at the International Center for CT, the ICCT. And last but not least, by Frédéric Gauthier, member of the Monitoring Committee for Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban at the United Nations Security Council. welcome to all of you. Before I will ask Professor Gunaratna to take the floor, I would like to announce just one, but an important housekeeping rule for this panel today. Since for security considerations, our colleague from the UN does not want to be known by name or face, in public, I would kindly ask you to not take pictures during the presentation and also to not refer to her on social media, Twitter or Facebook or you name it, by name regarding any statement she makes. So thank you very much for that. I know that some of our panelists already have been introduced during this conference because they spoke on the first day. So they have been introduced also with their bio, but I'm not sure whether all of you really attended the first day, nor do I know whether everyone really attended all the panels. So, and we have enough time this morning. It's an honor for me to introduce them to all of you properly. And I will start with Rohan Gunaratna. He is a specialist of the global threat environment with expertise in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Besides of being the director of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, Professor Gunaratna is also professor of security studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technical University. Professor Gunaratna holds various advisory positions, such as, and I'm really just picking some of them now, serving on the advisory board of the ICCT in The Hague, being a member of the International Senior Advisory Panel of the US Special Operations Command, and being a member of the steering committee of George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute. He was a senior fellow at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy and at the US Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. He is a highly valued expert who intensively worked with the UN and testified before the 9/11 Commission on the Structure of Al-Qaeda. And last but not least, he is the author as well as editor of numerous books on terrorism and counterterrorism, some of which I read during my dissertation on the terrorism in Sri Lanka. So he was kind of my childhood hero, which is a bit exaggerated, but still. Rohan Gunaratna will now speak about counterterrorism cooperation on the international level, and the title of his input is called From Counterterrorism Cooperation to Collaboration, the Essential Shift Fighting the Islamic State. So, Rohan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to focus on two areas. One is I want to focus on why we must shift from counterterrorism cooperation to collaboration. So the main theme of my presentation is why is this shift required when we fight IS and Al-Qaeda. The terrorism globalized after 9/11. Al-Qaeda itself decentralized after October of 2001 when the US-led coalition intervened in Afghanistan. So threat groups emerged in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Al-Qaeda created the platform for this by inviting more than 30 different groups to come to Afghanistan and train in Afghanistan. So Al-Qaeda imparted ideology, training, weapons, and finance to these groups. And after these groups dispersed from Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda built what is called a global jihad movement. IS is no different. More than 100 groups in the global south, they have pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So today we clearly have a network, and it certainly requires a network to defeat a network. But the type of networks that governments have, they are not capable to do that, because the government databases, for instance, they focus on personalities, on groups, on incidents. But we need to fight terrorism at the front end and at the back end, meaning we need specialist programs in prevention and in rehabilitation. And that is where ICTAC and other academic and think tanks can play a very important role. So the fight against terrorism, the spearhead is government. But we need community organizations, we need think tanks, and we need academia to play a very important role. It is not only those entities, but working increasingly with the religious institutions, with the educational institutions, with the internet service providers, with the media organizations. So a number of other partners have joined. And that is why we need to collaborate. And as we collaborate, there are 5 interfaces that I would like to share with you. The first interface is we have to build common databases. Databases between governments, between specialist research centers. So we have to move into more collaborative research, because if we do not do that, then we will all have part of the jigsaw puzzle with ourselves, but we will never see the entire picture. Second is exchange of personnel, secondment of people. Not only people within streams, for example, law enforcement personnel seconded from Britain to Israel, but also we need to move people across the military and the national security areas across these disciplines. Third is joint training. Joint training will always lead to joint operations. So the law enforcement, national security, and the military agencies, when it comes to certain training programs, can train together. And joint training will always lead to joint operations. Then finally, and the most precious thing, is the sharing of resources, expertise, and experience. I'll give you a very small example. I met a lady at this conference from France. I had met her previously. And she is just working on Telegram, you see. And today you cannot understand the current and emerging threat if you do not have access to Telegram. But she's Arabist, and she's able to gain access to those important Telegram groups that provide the sound and timely information. I cannot think of any other platform that is currently providing high quality, high grade information and intelligence on the current and emerging threat than focusing on Telegram. I asked her, okay, how do you disseminate your information? So I think that what is important for us to understand is that Telegram is largely now used by governments to understand the threat, but I think that an academic doing this is commendable. And if you look at Site Intelligence Group, for instance, its specialty is Telegram. So I think that it is critical for there to be that cooperation and collaboration between government, the private sector, and the community organizations. When it comes to universities, universities are not the central repositories of knowledge. It was. Today there are many government research centers that are doing brilliantly. And there are business institutions that are doing research. So I think that the quality of research produced by some of those business organizations is world class. So we need also to build that collaboration between these 3 arenas. Let me make a few concluding remarks, looking at how the threat is evolving and how the threat is spanning, and why it is important for us to collaborate. If you look at IS is shrinking its battle space in Syria and Iraq. But IS is in fact expanding globally. So we are witnessing a third phase in global jihad, which is the creation of provinces or wilayats in Nigeria, West Africa, in North Africa, going down from the Maghreb to the Sahel, in the Arabian Peninsula, focus in Yemen, in Caucasus, IS Caucasus and IS Khorasan. But these are the official provinces they have created. They have also created divisions elsewhere. I elaborated in my first presentation the emergence of IS in Marawi in the Philippines, in the distant edge of Asia. So you can see that although many countries are very happy about what is happening in Iraq and Syria today, that IS is shrinking, I think that we should all be very concerned. how IS is evolving, especially in cyberspace. And governments do not have the tools to fight IS in cyberspace. I would say that governments are going in a push cycle, and IS is going in a Ferrari. You see, there's a huge gap in the capabilities. So I think that we have to invest more on the prevention side to protect the Muslim communities. And secondly, those who are already radicalized, those who have already become extremists, those who have already become terrorists, we have to build those de-radicalization programs. The specialist center that I lead in Singapore, 50% of our staff are Muslims, and many of them are clerics. And I want to share with you that we have helped many governments to build their rehabilitation programs. I know that Israel is one country where they do not believe in terrorist rehabilitation. But I think that it is so important for the Judeo-Christian world to invest in this area, because if you do not rehabilitate those terrorists, what will happen is when they are released, they will pose a security threat, they will infect others, and they will become a part of the terrorist iconography. And the way to counter this is to use that precious moment to have those programs. And we, as a research and a training center, we are very happy to share that niche expertise that we have built on terrorist rehabilitation with any organization, whether it is a government or whether it is a private organization. There are 6 modes that we have developed, 6 interventions, type of interventions that can be implemented in prison: religious rehab, educational rehab, social and family rehab, vocational rehab, psychological rehab, recreational rehab, and creative arts in rehab. So we are also happy to provide a copy of our the information repository on rehabilitation to any specialist body that wants to work on that. And I want to say that as ICTAC moves to build greater collaboration with the UN, with other bodies, we are very happy to share that repository of information also with ICTAC, so that the universities themselves can play a very important role. Often when a government officer visits a prison to rehabilitate, to engage a detainee, there may be some resistance. But academic visiting, may be less resistance. Private sector funding programs in prison, less resistance. So my own view is that we have to work with a number of partners. Counter-terrorism has evolved already into enterprise, where no single agency has monopoly or capabilities. And the future success in the fight very much depends on moving from that cooperation to collaboration, where we all work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohan. Thank you especially for also touching upon the issue of de-radicalization, because seriously, you have a lot of experience, especially in Singapore with the center there, doing that. And I think that is one of the examples that show how important it is to have an exchange of experiences, also among leaders and practitioners and experts from Asia and Europe, because there is a completely different dialogue and discourse going on there, and we can learn a lot from your experiences in Singapore. So I'm happy now to introduce the next speaker, Professor Robert Friedman, who is founding director, as I already said, of the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, and Professor Emeritus of Criminal Justice at Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. I think that's the correct and complete title. He was the Distinguished Chair of Public Safety Partnerships and served as Chair of the Criminal Justice Department at Georgia State University. He is also the author of numerous books on the issue of community policing, terrorism, and crime analysis. And he also authored numerous articles and research reports on crime and criminal justice, focusing on policing and public safety. He holds various advisory positions too in memberships, such as, again, just a selection, the membership of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and its Community Policing Committee, the advisory board of the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, Herzliya, here in Israel, the Research Institute for European and American Studies in Athens, in Greece, and of the Executive Committee of the International Counterterrorism Academic Community, ICTAC. Dr. Friedman works closely with a number of police departments in the US and internationally on community policing and homeland security. And Professor Friedman, you will now speak on international cooperation to counter incitement to terrorism. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eichhorst. Good morning. What I would like to do in the short time that I have is perhaps introduce a conceptual approach, and I'll play the role of the academic here. But as the slide, can you put that slide back up? I want to sort of piggyback on it for a second, that Rohan put up. This is exactly what I've been doing for the last 25 years with police leaders, namely exchanging personnel, ideas, training, and creating a network of police professionals around the world. And we work with more than 20 countries and more than 20 states in the United States. What drives me conceptually, I'm a criminologist by training. I'm not a lawyer. Some people might think it's a disadvantage. What drives me is an old saying of the gentleman who is considered the father of modern sociology, Auguste Comte. In French, it says savoir pour prévoir and prévoir pour pouvoir. And in plain English, it's knowledge in order to predict, and predict in order to be able to do something about our situation. And that's the relevance for this session, because we want to use knowledge in order to create policies, in order to then build a network to beat a network. So I think for me, conceptually, this ties up very well. There's an old problem with policing that I think we find in the fight against terrorism as well. For some reason, there is an assumption among police departments around the world, and it's not only in the old dictatorial or Soviet-era police departments, that it is the responsibility of the police to protect the public, which in a sense is true, but it goes one step further, which means that the police can really impact crime. And I want to sort of question that, and I do. You see it oftentimes when crime statistics go down, police chiefs take credit for crime going down. They do not take the blame when crime goes up. And the analogy to terrorism is pretty similar. We sort of may have more successes in fighting terrorism in the preventive sense of using a pointed, designated force, usually special forces, police, and so on. But the problem is that both actions are reactive, pointed, rather than proactive. The assumption that police has the responsibility for controlling crime is flawed. Police can have one role among many partners that might help reduce and alleviate the crime problem. But keep in mind that unless the police are criminals, police do not produce, namely do not manufacture crime. So in order to understand who manufactures crime, you need to look at crime-causing conditions. And the analogy for the terrorist arena is quite similar. So what I'd like to present, and this is the conceptual approach that I would recommend that we think about, is actually taken from a public health model. And basically, if you take somebody with a cardiological problem to the emergency room, if you take that person in time to the emergency room, and there's good quality medical care, the person's life will probably be saved, and the quality of life may be improved for quite a number of years, And my now past mother-in-law is a very good example. However, if you want to resolve the epidemiology of cardiovascular diseases in the community, the response to it is not in the emergency room. So there's a fairly well-known study and field experiment that was done in Minnesota where it's called the Heart Health Project, where a community under controlled circumstances was given an exercise regimen, eating or food consumption regimen, and exercise and cholesterol or statin intake. And interestingly enough, the rate of the cardiovascular diseases has dropped significantly. So if you look at the community as producing, in this case, cardiovascular diseases, look at it in the same fashion as a community that produces criminals or the community that produces terrorists. And I think that partly because of the media, partly because of politicians, and partly because of human nature, the old type of crimes that are violent take far more interest than nonviolent crimes, partly because we would rather be conned out of a $12 fake perfume than be beaten over the head for it. But it's the same crime with the same impact, but we would prefer not to be hurt bodily. So now if you look at terrorism, clearly when you have a bus exploding or a coffee shop exploding or a hotel a terrorist attack or a pizzeria and so on and so forth, it is devastating under any measure that you look at it. But what we don't see in this single event is the whole process, the entire process that led to it. So we're taking the one slide with what I call the explosion slide, the pyrotechnic slide, was it shooting, stabbing, car ramming, you name it, and we focus on that instead of focusing, or in addition to focusing on what it is that led to it. And what leads to it is an ideological environment that is filled with what some people call propaganda. I call it incitement, but it's an ideology that A, leads, encourages, urges people to commit that kind of activity, and then justifies it after the fact. And it's almost hard to conceptualize that we actually, as a society, anywhere, we're living with the fact that people's heads are beheaded, or they are stabbed, or they are rammed over by cars, and there's not that much that we as individuals can do. And this is why the importance of the network is important. So my sense of optimism is that if indeed we recognize that it is incitement that leads to that, I can show you, and I'm sure that you've seen tons of videos of clerics inciting, literally wielding a knife on the pulpit and saying, cut them to pieces and do that, in groups, and then do it as much as possible. If you read Inspire magazine or the Big magazine, it gives you advice from anywhere from how to build a car in your mother's kitchen to how to take a Ford 150 and put saws on the wheels, on the tires, and mow people in. And it's a very cheap and easy method to then have what we mistakenly call the lone wolves, and somebody gets up in the morning for whatever reason that he may not have known yesterday, actually does that. The NYPD deemed the Times Square ramming of pedestrians as a non-terrorist incident. I beg to differ. The FBI, by the way, declared the Egypt Air on October 31st, 1999 as a non-terrorist incident. I beg to differ. And the reason I beg to differ is because if that pilot committed suicide, it at the very least is a suicide homicide pact. It's not, if you commit suicide, you die on your own. You don't kill other people in the process. The gentleman who did the New York Times, it's close to New York Times, but the Times Square ramming was inspired to do that act by something that he has seen. Whether he was driven by that ideology or not is almost irrelevant. So given the scope of these ideologies and the extent to which they have taken place, as Rohan has described, literally all over the world, it is the responsibility, first of all, of governments, and then the network that Rohan suggested of think tanks and academics and practitioners, advocacy groups, to focus efforts on the incitement to do that, to delegitimize the incitement. Because all of this is not instead of the reactive measures that oftentimes are required and needed, but it is in addition to, and for the long term, and I'm not talking about next Monday or next year, but for the longer term, it's a generational issue by now, we need to have a lever to try and minimize the production of that. And if I'm fairly convinced that if we can focus on the clerics who are inciting, and if that changes, that narrative changes, that will have a major influence. I'll try and end with an anecdote that has to do or illustrates the issue of usage of media, usage of concepts, and perceptions. And all of these then become a reality. Last year, I was invited to give a talk about terrorism to a fairly large audience in West Palm Beach, Florida. And this was to commemorate September 11, and there were probably about 400 or 500 people in the room. And it was organized by a local alliance of Catholics, Jews, Muslims, wide area of community representatives. And at the end of the talk, several members came up to me and talked, and a few of them were from the Muslim Alliance. And one gentleman said, you know, I really liked your talk, and I sort of was pleasantly surprised. And he says, but I have one request from you. I said, what is it? He said, you know, please don't use the term Islamic State when you give these talks. And I said, and what would you recommend that I use? He says, use Daesh. I said, but Daesh is Dawla Islamiyya, which means Islamic State. He says, yes, but when you say Daesh, it doesn't have the word Islamic in it. And I looked at him and I said, so let me understand the rules of the game here. I'm making you uncomfortable because of something that people that you are affiliated with are doing and you don't like it. You don't need me as a mediator. Go directly to them. Ask them simply not to do that. And he looked at me with open mouth because nobody has ever told him this before. And I think that that is where you can start making changes, because communities that are anchored in host communities, if you will, have been for a very long time, for politically correct and other reasons, given a carte blanche to this kind of behavior without calling them to task. And this is a fight that we can win because you don't need to be an 18 or 21-year-old soldier who's running with full gear on the hills and doing ambushes and special forces operations. You know, a young 85-year-old gentleman or lady can do it in the supermarket when arguing with somebody on an ideological issue. We do not pay enough attention to this because we'll pay attention to the weather report, but who wants to read a horrible article in Inspire or some propaganda from Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or any other group that basically says, we want to kill you, and the more the better. We try to wish it away. And I think that it is the time now for governments to take concerted efforts. And this is where this becomes difficult. I mean, I'm not that naive to think it will happen tomorrow. If I continue, and I'll finish with that, if I continue with the model of the public health, the rate of smoking, for example, in the United States has decreased significantly. But there's a homeostasis, and what happened is the cigarette companies are now selling cigarettes where? In China. So one can say, well, if the Chinese want to smoke themselves to death, that's fine. But I don't think it is. And in a sense, all it does, it moves the problem from one place to another place. And I think it's the same thing about the cooperation between governments. Governments need to collaborate, to cooperate, to use Rohan's terms. And I think that the role of groups like ours is to facilitate that and to have legislation that will indeed take care of it. And not just legislation. There's legislation in the United States, but very few prosecutors are going to take that to court because they're not likely to win it because of how the First Amendment is interpreted. So it's not an easy challenge, but it can be done. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this conceptual issue of what leads to the act and not just the act itself. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Friedman. Thank you especially for touching upon also the issue of the need to focus on clerics that are engaging in incitement, and by this also to bring up the issue of how to engage with the Muslim community. And here again, I think we have very different situations when it comes to Singapore, for example, where my impression is that it's quite self-evident that Muslim clerics also engage in the in the endeavor to create counter narratives and to work against incitement. While in Germany, for example, me being from Germany, now having the German perspective, but where you have a high degree of political correctness when it comes to these issues, and where you really have to find a way of engaging with the Muslim community without discriminating, but at the same time calling things by name. I think that is something where we also can learn from other parts of the world. So I'm happy now to introduce Professor Gregory Rose to you. Professor Rose is a professor with the School of Law at the University of Wollongong, specializing in international law. His two research interests are quite interesting because they seem to be disparate, but in the end it turns out that it makes a lot of sense to combine them. It's the applications of international law to counterterrorism and to environmental protection. Greg's current research in the area of counterterrorism concerns the emergence of new international humanitarian norms in the handling and transfer of detainees who have been engaged in hostilities during international military operations. And on the ways that humanitarian law controversies are used or played into lawfare to delegitimize counterterrorism. So again, a little bit the issue of political correctness, if I understand it correctly. Maybe not. He has been a visiting fellow at the ICT and a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism at Syracuse University and at the Asia Pacific Center for Military Law at the University of Melbourne. He has consulted extensively for the Royal Australian Navy, the UN Environment Programme, and the Australian government. And prior to his academic appointment, Greg was the head of the Environmental Law Unit at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. And Professor Rose will now speak about comparing national approaches to tackle terrorism funding via charities, and he will touch upon an example that many of you will know about. Greg, the floor is yours.
Now you've all seen the presentation. Thank you very much. It's an honour to be here as a member of ICTAC, and I thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for its efforts in sponsoring this session and myself, and it's a pleasure always to be back at the IDC and the ICT as part of a family. Yesterday afternoon we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the New Battlefields Old Laws workshop, which has been run through this conference for several years, and which I first participated in 2007. And listening to Kristina's bio, that's definitely too long, an older bio, I almost fell asleep. It made me feel old. And I often feel when with such an eminent panel that I'm a newcomer, on the other hand, because most of my career has been spent in international environmental law and recently in transnational environmental crime. And I should point out that these are Australian lorikeets, parrots that we have in our front garden, and they're quite criminal themselves. They attack other birds to get the seeds in the feeder. All right, I'm afraid that was a little idiosyncratic. Now, I presented an earlier version of this paper, which has been accepted by the Australian Law Journal, but will need to be updated by the time that comes out. I presented it in June, and one of the interesting comments that came from the audience was that a couple of members of the audience expressed their experiences with charities where they had sponsored a child, and one of the members had gone on a job mission to Bangladesh and wanted to meet the child that she was sponsoring, and found that there was no child. It's actually a program, and the child sponsoring is the incentive to participate in the program. And another had sponsored 3 goats, but what really got her goat was that there was no goat in the end. Now, the little quote that I have up here from Robert Jackson, when he was a US Supreme Court judge, he was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, identifies the problem that men and women are often bribed by their loyalties and ambitions more than by money. And so in NGOs that wish to do the right thing, there's often a problem of compromise, of breaching of the rules of proper conduct as a result of values. And this is actually quite explicit and even a virtue in some senses, where NGOs would say the humanitarian imperative is my main concern. And the risk of diversion of funds provided in a conflict zone into political violence or terrorism is just part of the cost of doing business, but more important is that the children be fed, and if the majority or even half the money is going to feed children, then I go to bed with a clear conscience. Maybe not everybody would feel as comfortable and sleep as well, and this has proved itself a problem in practice. You might have picked up in the press that Wahid Borsh, an engineer working for the UN Development Programme in Gaza, was convicted here in Israel in January this year for diverting materials to build a naval jetty for Hamas. And then last year, Mohammed El-Halabi was arrested at the Keren Shalom crossing. He'd been under surveillance for some time in relation to the diversion of funds for Hamas from the charity that he was working for. So he was and still is, the director of operations for World Vision in Gaza. And his case is ongoing in the district court in Beersheba at the moment. He pleaded not guilty in July, and charges were increased as a consequence of the failure of a plea bargain to include treason. Now, what I'm going to do today is look at the issue of ensuring integrity in funding through charities, and that requires that there be assessment of the risk of diversion of funds, that there be accountability for those funds and that there be liability for their misuse. I'm going to obviously be looking at the transnational context and diversion into purposes of terrorism and the opportunities for networking across international regulatory agencies. So the two principal areas of focus that I'll look at are ones that are easier to grasp, which are simply the paying of terrorist salaries that's been in the press a lot lately, and incitement. I hope that I won't be too parochial. There's a little bit more on the El Halabi case study, and then I'll look at the regulation of charities and aid. So the majority of charitable income is from private sources, but there's a lot of government assistance that goes into using charities efficiently as service organisations. And for example, in Australia, about 40% of charitable funding comes from government, where charities have lower overheads in providing soup kitchens and assistance, but also in providing humanitarian assistance in Gaza, Jerusalem, or the West Bank. And I'll finish with looking forward to improved standards in future. So here we have a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council receiving his salary from the Palestinian Authority for 40 years, despite conviction on 4 counts of murder. When this was raised in the European Parliament due to the funding that's provided to the Palestinian Authority, it was checked off against the Pegasus database that the European Commission maintains for Palestinian Authority employees, and it was identified that he's not an employee, so it's not actually a classic case of paying an employee salary, but rather he's a member of Parliament, so it's different. The other celebrated example recently has been that of Taylor Force, because of the introduction in the US House of Reps of the Taylor Force Act to deduct payments to the Palestinian Authority by the American taxpayer for in the equivalent amount of those that go into salaries of convicted terrorists. There's been a bit of shifting around in the arrangement of those payments, so that instead of going direct to terrorist bank accounts, they go to family bank accounts, and they've been shifted out of the Palestinian Authority aegis or umbrella to that of PLO umbrella for payments, but the same infrastructure still makes the payments. And as you can see, it amounts to a huge amount per annum, $332 million. So that's in relation to salaries. The other example I wanted to give is the incitement to violence. And there's often a series of shades of grey between inciting to violence and boycott, divestment and sanctions. And here I might risk being a little bit controversial in identifying European governments in particular, but also my own, in relation to culpable negligence in funding incitement through a series of NGOs which subscribe to boycotts, divestments, and also hate speech and occasionally explicit calls to terrorist violence. So that's from the EU, $40 to $50 million euros per annum provided. And 11 million of that actually goes to NGOs in Israel rather than within the Palestinian authorities. So this is where perhaps the presentation does become its most parochial and controversial. It was only 150 years ago that if a pogrom was to be organised, the Tsar would have a word with a few of the lieutenants in the Russian army, and they would speak to some village heads, and there would be a looking away whilst a pogrom was initiated and houses and villages burned. And I wonder, is it so different today to look away when government aid is provided to charity actors for provision of assistance that is diverted into terrorism and incitement to violence. Government aid is only one of the sources of charitable funding. There's also independent fundraising, and in the case of terrorist organisations, criminal proceeds directly acquired. So in the case of World Vision, we have Australia's largest charity with an income of $500 million a year. Its global income is about $2.5 billion. It's based in California. The Australian operation is about a sixth of the total global income, so it's relatively large in comparison to the size of the Australian population and economy. It's been working in the Holy Land since the 1970s, and in terms of figures spent, it spends $17.5 million a year and has 150 staff in Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza areas, and about 30% of that goes into Gaza funding at about just under $5 million per annum. It's alleged that 60% of this was diverted to Hamas resources. Now, the methodologies for diversion, and this is a term of art, methodologies are used in identifying the patterns for hiding funds in money laundering. So money laundering involves acquiring funds, layering them in order to hide them, and then transferring them. And the methodologies for terrorism financing in this particular case involved false registration of employees, fictitious receipts and inflated invoices, and favouring complicit tenderers and disguising warehouse transfers. So it wasn't just funds, but resources that were transferred. And as a consequence of the arrest, Australia, which had provided $5 million in the past 3 years to World Vision for its Gaza operations, suspended further funding. The German government also suspended 3.6 million euros that it had earmarked, and the UK Department for International Development has acted similarly. So for World Vision, this is a major tragedy, that something has gone wrong that is affecting its funding base and tarnishing its reputation, and World Vision is very keen to do what it can to clear its reputation and to improve its accountability and supervision methods. And in fact, a friend of mine, Professor Tim McCormack from the University of Melbourne, Professor of Humanitarian Law, well known here and in Israel, who served on the Turkel Commission concerning the Mavi Mara incident in 2010, when there was an inquiry into the Israeli use of force against the Turkish flotilla, is on the board of World Vision, and was probably put on the board because of the sensitivities with World Vision's Israel-related operations. And he was assigned to initiate an internal inquiry in World Vision as to the oversight methods that they're using. At present, none of that information is being disclosed, and World Vision is awaiting the outcome of the case, which we think may be later this year. But it's a common pattern, one that's been identified and tracked and documented by NGO Monitor for NGOs financed by governments in the UK, Ireland, France, Germany and elsewhere, where the NGO is the service organisation that is the conduit for government assistance, and it works with local partners in situ, and it has responsibility then for ensuring that the local partners treat the funds and assistance provided appropriately. In Australia, we are party to the Convention for the Suppression of Terrorism Financing through the Criminal Code and the Counter-Terrorism Financing Act. And I'm actually just warming up, but about to finish. So There's an NGO Cooperation Agreement. A similar approach is used in Canada and in the USA, where the NGOs, which are the conduits for funds, have to sign up front that they will observe integrity standards. But part of the problem is that they have to then do their own integrity checking on their local partners. So there's a certain amount to be learnt through comparing approaches. The Australian government expects the NGOs that it funds to search the internet and identify any risk themselves. The US, on the other hand, has a vetting centre in Washington in the USAID headquarters, and particularly for operations in this region, in Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, there are 3 people located in Jerusalem that are responsible full-time for vetting. So that's a major commitment to ensuring integrity. And in Canada, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, provides intelligence to the Charities Directorate within the tax office. In Australia, we're just learning that, to connect up financial intelligence with the Charities Directorate in order to facilitate a greater flow of information. But networking within government is necessary across the different agencies. So the first place to start networking is within your own government, and often that isn't the case. Information is held in silos and it's subject to confidentiality concerns. I'm going to expedite the conclusion of this talk, perhaps with a little video then that just focuses on intelligence sharing for combating misuse of funds. Now, this is what we would call meso-level networking. Governance, the idea of governance. I'll just find the volume control.
These crimes endanger the lives of Australians, undermine the integrity of our financial system, and weaken the nation's economy. Law enforcement, security agencies and industry can no longer fight these threats alone. Government and industry must work together. That's why AUSTRAC has established the Fintel Alliance. It's a unique partnership to fight serious crime and terrorism financing. AUSTRAC receives reports from more than 14,000 Australian businesses, ranging from major banks and casinos to small operators. A threshold transaction report, or TTR, is generated when $10,000 or more in cash is deposited into a person's bank account. AUSTRAC's expert analysts use the data provided by its reporting entities and other sources to join the dots to provide a complete financial intelligence picture.
Jane, can you come here for a moment? I need you to have a look at something. If you have a look at this trend graph here, there's something suspicious going on.
There's something very wrong with that. How about we get Jake on the back to have a look and see what we can find.
Good idea. Jake, can you come and see us for a moment? Jake, have a look at this here. I think we've got a few anomalies. What do you think? Gregory, let me bring up this customer's account.
So we have the Financial Intelligence Agency working in partnership with the banks, then calling in law enforcement, all middle-level governance networking, which can be extended internationally.
All right, well, let's give this a customer of any of the other banks as well.
Sophia from ABC Bank has found that the target also holds an account with her institution.
We're seeing regular deposits in much lesser amounts going into that account, and I've placed an urgent call with our risk and compliance team to put him on our alert list. So this looks like he could be involved in money laundering, and I think it's time that we got law enforcement involved.
Responding swiftly to intelligence is critical. Fintel Alliance brings together banks, remitters and law enforcement partners under one roof to interact in near real time to quickly assess a situation.
So that's a very brief example of a brand new initiative. It was launched in March. It's only just become operative. New Zealand and the UK are partners in it. The idea is to establish an international alliance on financial intelligence that addresses counterterrorism financing and anti-money laundering. And what I've attempted to do today in a fairly obtuse way is to point out that a small corner of the need for networking nationally and internationally is in relation to counterterrorism financing, and an important corner of that is the channeling of funds through NGOs and NGO accountability. We have layers of bureaucracy that overlay each other and make it more difficult for direct regulatory and accountability patterns to be established. And that's a challenge that's only just being faced. Here I have a report of the Australian Transaction and Reporting Analysis Centre. It only came out 2 weeks ago. It's the first analysis that's been done of risk of counterterrorism financing in the not-for-profit sector. And we're really in a new area of development here in relation to both anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing. And I think there's an opportunity for international collaboration amongst academics and practitioners here, one that the Fintel Alliance is promoting, to establish standards and implement standards to meet this challenge. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rose. Did I hear a slight amount of criticism of European governments handling?
I didn't hear that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, but I think it also hints at another aspect of counterterrorism, because the behavior of democratically elected governments is, of course, in some sort of reflection of their societies and political culture. And I think it shows that when it comes to the battlefield of ideas, that also our societies have to be part of counterterrorism efforts, in a sense that we have to explain to our public that it's not a white-black thing, that, you know, that NGOs are not, it's not a synonym for the good guys, like you have it in Germany. It's always the good guys, NGOs, automatically, but that you really have to have a critical look upon everything and then decide with whom you are dealing and how to spend your money when it comes to charities. So I think we have to have a discourse on these issues. I am happy to now have a speaker who will touch upon these issues in a certain sense, at least. Professor Alex Schmid. He is research fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, and a director of the Terrorism Research Initiative. He was co-editor of the journal Terrorism and Political Violence and is currently editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Terrorism. Professor Schmid held a chair in international relations at the University of St. Andrews, where he was until 2009 also director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. And he was officer in charge of the Terrorism Prevention Branch at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, in the rank of Senior Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer. And prior to that, he was an elected member of the executive board of the International Scientific and Professional Advisory Council of the United Nations Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program. Until 1999, he held, among other positions, the position of extraordinary professor for the empirical study of conflict and conflict resolution at the Department of Sociology at the University of Rotterdam. And currently, Dr. Schmid serves on a number of advisory boards and is also a senior fellow of the Memorial Institute for the Prevention of Terrorism in Oklahoma. Dr. Schmid has lectured in nearly 30 countries, and his work has been published in 10 languages. And also, Dr. Schmid has more than 180 publications and reports to his name. Professor Schmid will now focus on the issue of counterterrorism cooperation between universities and governments, possibilities and problems. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. 3 years ago, Mark Sageman published a polemic, The Stagnation in terrorism research. It's a field where a lot is published. Every 3 hours a new book comes out, and most of the authors have never talked to a terrorist. So Mark Sageman said, we have a system of terrorism research in which intelligence analysts know everything but understand nothing, while academics understand everything but know nothing. Adding, this is critique is but the last of a long Jeremy night going back almost 40 years about the poor quality of research. The relationship between academia and governments has rarely been an easy one, certainly not in the field of social sciences. I remember after the invasion of Iraq, how the British academic community reacted to Tony Blair's participation in that foolish venture. We had a new branch of terrorism research in the form of critical terrorism studies, while others who cooperated in one way or another with the government were called terrorologists. I was one of them. So we had a branch that emerged on Terrorism and Political Violence Association that sought some form of cooperation with government. As long as a government is a democratic government upholding the rule of law and human rights, this is what it should be. Of course, democratic governments are not without flaws, certainly not when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to former colonial powers or an imperial power like the United States, where one of the presidential advisors said terrorism is the price of empire. But in general, the democratic process allows for reform and improvement and peaceful change that makes democracies on the whole more successful. Universities are supposed to be the guardians of scientific objectivity, organized skepticism, and independent thinking outside the box of political correctness. Of course, universities too have many flaws. Some of them have, by acts of omission rather than commission, done bad work, neglect of value education. For instance, it's a strange fact that many of the terrorists have actually a degree in engineering or in medicine. I think of Ayman al-Zawahiri or Dr. Fadl. So there's a series of tensions in the relationship between government and academia. And I mentioned here, I would like to go through these briefly. Governments are in the possession of a huge amount of data, many more data than civil servants can possibly absorb. To access and analyze such data, especially those held by intelligence agencies, is a dream of many academics. After all, if you want to find something new, and you don't have a new theory or a new method, lots of data is what can make your publication something new. Sometimes governments are willing to share such data, but a big obstacle here are security clearances. To get such a clearance is often expensive and time-consuming. I have, as an academic, seen many top secret documents. I'm a historian by training, so they are 30, 50 years old. I've seen some fresher ones. I once passed the desk of an intelligence officer, and the file was marked top secret, and somebody had written, I could just glance it, if this gets into the hands of the Russians, it's goodbye for the Western world. So I was very curious what's in it. That was 5 years before it was goodbye for the Soviet Union. So if academics are allowed to work with secret materials, they have to sign a cooperative agreement with certain rules of what can be published and cannot be published. It's a very unequal relationship. It's a high price to pay for the independence. The assumption that secret information is by its very nature superior and therefore attractive for researchers is largely an illusion. The reason the information is classified has little or nothing to do with its quality. It occurs mainly to protect sources and methods of information gathering. When the sources provide false or misleading information, the highest level of intelligence classification does not attest to the veracity of such information. In other words, secret information is not inherently more reliable than open source information, nor is secret intelligence per definition less reliable than open source information. In the intelligence community, there is a greater degree of conformism than in the academic community, and it's often difficult to share information between intelligence agencies, certainly of different countries, but even within one country. Knowledge is power, and if you're an intelligence officer, you can keep some information back strategically and win appreciation by pulling it out, a crucial piece of intelligence out of the files at the right moment, like a magician pulling a rabbit out of his hat. In doing so, you can win an argument and further down the line, perhaps promotion. So withholding information is sometimes strategically advantageous. The price of secrecy is that outside review of intelligence analysis processes is taking place only after major scandals and intelligence failures. The 9/11 Commission, for instance, was forced on an unwilling Bush administration, only thanks to the moral pressure from victims and survivors. And even then, the process of fact-finding was frequently sabotaged. It was only last year that the last 28 pages of this 9/11 Commission report, referring to the Saudi involvement in the financing of 14 out of the 19 hijackers, was finally released. And probably there would be a similar scandal to the Russian scandal now if you looked at some of the foreign financing of US election campaign. But it works the other way around. Many, many foreign campaigns have been financed by the United States, but there's another trajectory. So there is a dilemma, secrecy versus openness. There is also a dilemma, closeness to state powers versus critical distance to those holding state powers. By its very nature, intelligence services are close to the center of power. In fact, many heads of government and their ministers could not last long without them, certainly not in undemocratic regimes. Intelligence agencies tend to represent and defend the status quo, which in a fast-paced world can make them de facto reactionary forces in politics. Academics, on the other hand, at least those in the social sciences, and perhaps those of my generation, tend to be open for what lives in society and what emerges from social movements. Academic teachers are closer to what moves youth, since teaching and learning is a two-way process. So on the whole, at least my generation of academics was more on the left than government intelligence agency, which created mistrust between the two. So for the government, it's always safer to go to researchers in a think tank, who are academics most of the time, and then get the results that bring no unwelcome truths or surprises. Governments also have developed huge in-house research facilities, and so they have a certain control of what is going on. Of course, there are meetings between academia and intelligence services. I remember once meeting the head of a major national intelligence services. He said, after second drink or third, we are gentlemen who behave like gangsters. So I had to suppress the question, how can I tell you sort of people from gangsters who behave like gentlemen? So there's a shady world there. And if you have a war situation, of course, the academics line up behind the government, but we are in this gray zone of the war on terror, which is, or a long time, was more a metaphorical war like the war on poverty or the war on drugs. So I will skip some parts of here. There I go back to the Iraq War and come to the third dilemma, national versus universal focus. Academics tend to be universal in their orientation. A university staff of a university is often multinational, multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious, and very diverse in its political views, while the government really, often intelligence agencies, hire people from their own track. So if you are Mormon from Utah, you have a better chance than you are a Muslim from Iran who immigrated in the country. But in many ways, to work with intelligence agency does not really require access to classified information. I have been doing, after the end of the Cold War, scenario writing for a national government, and for that sort of thing, what's the next 5-10 years conflict situation? You don't really need much classified negotiation, classified information, but you had constantly pressures there as well. I remember when I presented 5 scenarios to the defense establishment, I was pulled aside by somebody from the minesweepers. Can you not put some minesweeping element in any of your scenarios? We want a future too. So the pressure's there as well. So in sum, the relationship between the intelligence community and the academic community is never free of tension, but there is room for greater synergy and even a partnership. But the possibilities and limits of this relationship have to be laid out clearly. I mentioned here some form of this partnership, which I experienced at different periods of my career. And I have often found that the problem is more on the side of the university. For instance, in one case, the ethics committee said, well, you cannot, we were analyzing the hard disks of suspected terrorists, and they said, if that becomes known in the public, we will not be able to do field research in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Of course, they had no intention to go there, but they managed to sabotage that project. So it's still going on, but outside that context of that particular university, one of 12 I worked on in my 40 years in this field. So there are opportunities for cooperation. There are enormous gains to be made from some cooperation. But I must say that in my contacts with intelligence officials, I was often more impressed by the quality of their analysis than by the quality of many academic analysis. And as editor-in-chief of journals, I've seen a lot of academic stuff that would not make it through intelligence evaluation process. So the relationship between the two is one that has to be developed over time. It's a matter of trust. It takes years to gain trust. It takes only one moment to lose trust. But we are, after the war on terror has been declared, or the war on Western civilization has been declared more than 20 years ago by Al-Qaeda and later by other organizations, has long not been taken seriously, certainly not been taken seriously. But this is an existential conflict. We had in the 20th century 2 such conflicts. Communism, which divided mankind according to class lines. bourgeoisie and the working class. We had fascism that divided mankind along race lines into a Herrenrasse and the shabby rest of us. And now we have this division by faith where one religious interpretation divides mankind into true Muslims and all the rest are heretics. So this is an existential threat, and as I showed with some PowerPoints in my keynote address, this is getting so serious that close cooperation between academia and the intelligence community is becoming a must. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Schmid. I truly loved your term terrorologist. Is that true? Is it the right terrorologist? I would try to remember that. That is a fancy term for what we are doing every day. We are coming now to our last but certainly not least speaker today, Ms. Frédérique Gauthier, who is going to join us now.